Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 21 team selection, and this is once again another crazy game week where we don't have perfect information. The reality, of course, is that we are heading towards a landscape of blank game weeks and double game weeks, and we still don't really know what double game weeks we can truly expect. There's a pretty high chance of, let's say, Man City versus Brentford and Liverpool versus Luton being rescheduled to Game Week 25, but we also think that there's equally, I think, a good chance that the games could still be rescheduled later on in the season. For example, Game Week 25 for the Man City game, or even later for Liverpool. As far as my team last week, we got 94 points, and that's despite, of course, captaining Alvarez over Salah. But I'm still happy with the team as it stands because it still seems like, even though Haaland is actually close and that he's actually been pictured, for example, in full training, and people have mentioned that he's looked good, that the reality is when you look at, for example, let's say KDB and Doku's appearances, for example, in the Huddersfield game, that Man City are probably going to take a little bit of caution with Haaland. And since there's a 2-week break between the Newcastle game and the Burnley game, I'm still expecting for him to start, earliest really versus Burnley, and maybe of course play a part within the Newcastle game, but really come off the bench instead and play 20 to 30 minutes. So in this landscape, I'll sort of be assuming that Haaland will not be starting. However, of course, we could get some crazy news tomorrow on Friday, which will also be the new deadline. So if you thought the deadline was on Saturday, UK time, that's no longer the case. We have a rescheduled game, or rather the game between, let's say, Burnley and Luton has been sort of fast forwarded into Friday evening. And so that deadline is going to be a little bit faster. So I will be, of course, streaming on the deadline. So do look forward to seeing you there. But in terms of, for example, my team and how that changes things, not much really, right? Less of a chance, in my opinion, that we actually get some City news. So my assumption is that Haaland is actually going to start on the bench. So I will be sort of taking that approach. Right now with my team, of course, since I do own Salah and Son, and we now have the Trent Alexander-Arnold injury, clearly, of course, there are a couple issues that my team has to rectify, right? And unfortunately, of course, by owning Trent, I suppose, my team structure isn't necessarily easily going to a Haaland structure per se. In fact, of course, it's nice that I have 2 free transfers, but it's also a little bit tough to sort of manage both Salah being out, Son being out, and unfortunately Trent being out now too. So right now, if Haaland is out, I think that still leaves us with good ground, right? Because we expect him to start off the bench, or on the bench rather, and that would allow me to, let's say, either address Trent and Salah, or just one of the two of them. Potentially, of course, I might not even need to address Salah at all, and that's going to be one of my transfer paths. My transfer path number 1 is actually just going to be going from Son to Foden. And the reason why I actually want to go out of Son as opposed to Salah is, first of all, if you look at, for example, the odds between, let's say, all the teams that are going to feature, for example, in the AFCON and also the Asian Cup, still, when you compare, let's say, Egypt to South Korea, I know a lot of people have really high standards and expectations for Egypt in the AFCON, but the reality, of course, is South Korea are mega favorites as well for the Asian Cup. They're still third right now in terms of bookies odds. I'm not saying bookies odds are completely correct, but I think it's a good sort of justification of what we can sort of reasonably predict, right? And there's a lot of money, for example, being thrown in there. So I think it's worth sort of thinking about it as like an intuitive guess as to when the teams come back. Egypt, on the other hand, are actually predicted to be 5th in terms of bookie favorites. And so that sort of, that could actually land them, for example, outside of the semifinals. Maybe it's unlikely that you think that will happen. I think the reality, of course, is that it's very, very likely that both Salah and Son will be heading towards the semifinals of their sort of respective sort of conference cups. And for that reason alone, I think a strategy, let's say, where we hold Salah or Son is a bit risky, but it could pay off because, as I said, Liverpool do have a chance of a double game week on Game Week 25. And by holding Salah, it is an easy way to get towards Salah, and potentially, of course, he could be the best captaincy opportunity of a double game week this season in Game Week 25 if that double game week does come to fruition. So that's one of my strategies in place. So that's the alternative one. As I said, my first transfer plan is going to be purely Son to Foden. And Son to Foden will be sort of the opposite plan, where I think the assumption next week is that to take out, let's say, Haaland, I'll probably also go out of Salah on Game Week 22. So by going for Son to Foden and rolling the second free transfer, I still have to make 2 moves to get towards Haaland. And that's okay in my mind because Foden, I think, right now is an extremely appealing asset. And he's one of the midfielders that I really like. He also has a chance himself of having a double game week in 25. So even though I might, for example, miss out on Salah in Game Week 25, it's not the worst thing in the world, in my opinion. However, of course, holding Trent in my team, there's another question as to whether that's valid, right? Because we expect Trent's injury to be a couple of weeks, right? Based on what Pep Linders has actually mentioned. So based on what we expect Trent's injury to be, which is sort of like a grade 1 injury, I think a lot of people are predicting that he's going to come back in 4 to 6 weeks. And so that time frame actually allows for him to maybe come back versus Burnley, which is the ideal game you want him to come back for, right? Because game week 22, game week 23 aren't necessarily perfect fixtures for Trent. But if he can come back and you can actually capitalize on that Burnley fixture with Trent, I think there's a lot of appeal to maybe keeping Trent in your teams as well. And unfortunately, of course, in this situation, I'm basically deciding in my head whether I want to keep Salah or whether I want to keep Trent. Generally, I think I want to keep Salah, even though, as I said, it's pretty likely that Egypt will advance pretty far in the AFCON. So it's very close right now in terms of my transfer plans. If I could get any, for example, information as to, let's say, how soon, for example, Trent is going to come back, that could change my mind in terms of my transfer. Generally speaking, as I said, I do prefer the Salah move and keeping Salah over this period in time, just because with the Trent injury, I no longer have sort of reason to have such a beefy team when it comes to the sort of transfer value side of things, right? Without Trent being an option, the next best defender, in my opinion, to sort of replace Trent with is either Walker from a sort of price value point of view, if we expect double game week 25 to happen for City, or it's Estupiñán at 4.9 or 5 million, whatever he is at the time of this video. So those are my thoughts right now between, let's say, holding Salah and holding Trent, and what the impacts are too. Because I feel like some of us could actually be thinking about pursuing a game week 25 free hit strategy, or for example, making transfers in the back of our head, knowing that we could be free hitting on 25. However, as I said, because game week 25 is so good potentially for both Haaland or Salah, you're looking at it as a good opportunity, in my opinion, to actually exercise the chip strategy where you are going to be playing the triple captaincy on game week 25. So for that reason, I kind of like keeping my options open with the best captain possible, considering Salah would be getting to play Luton at home. And so that's why I really do like keeping Salah. So in that sort of Salah structure, how would I keep Salah? I think the way that I would do this is by selling Trent immediately, going out of Trent and going into Estupiñán. And also, because I actually can't, for example, afford Haaland in one free transfer, if I go for Foden from Son, it would make sense for me instead to actually go from Son to someone like Gross. And Gross ultimately has really good fixtures as well. Similar logic to going for Estupiñán. You're sort of targeting Brighton's really good games, good offensive fixtures where, of course, the attacking player should hopefully benefit. And ultimately, in a miraculous situation, I suppose there are opportunities where hopefully, if, let's say, João Pedro's off the field and Brighton get a penalty, maybe it could land to Gross as well. But in reality, of course, we're picking Gross because he has really good open play underlying stats, and also because he's a set-piece taker for the team, as we can see with the sort of multitude of assists that he's actually racked up lately. So that's sort of the landscape right now. If I was, let's say, to pursue that strategy where I just simply do one free transfer and it's Son to Foden, then I think that gives me a bit more flexibility, right? Because a lot of us are thinking about, what will happen in terms of the potential blanks in the future, what will happen in terms of cup results, and maybe, of course, because there's so much of a timeline between game week 21 and 22, we can once again see injuries occurring, and maybe having 2 free transfers for game week 22 can be a little bit beneficial for me. And so that's an option, I think, as well, sort of thinking in my mind why it would be useful to just use one free transfer this week and to keep my options a little bit more open than I would be if I was to pursue, let's say, using 2 free transfers on game week 21. So that for me is like the sort of juggling that I have to do in my mind as an FPL manager. But I do like, for example, Foden in the short term. He still appeals me a little bit more than Gross, obviously. If I had to compare like for like, I do, of course, prefer Foden over Gross. But there are drawbacks, obviously, as well, right? It's very hard for me to get back to Salah reasonably still on game week 25 if I was to, let's say, bring him out of my team in game week 21 or 22. So those are my thoughts. Son to Foden is a nice opportunity here. I would actually be playing a team selection, which is going to be option number 1 here, as I said, of Areola. I'd be playing Colwill 2 versus Fulham. Not expecting much really from Colwill and Gabriel, but you just kind of have to play what you have, right? Colwill and Gabriel. Playing Pedro Porro versus Man United. Once again, not a great fixture just because it's an away fixture, but Porro has been brilliant lately, and Maddison, I still probably would not expect for him to feature in this game, so very likely we get to enjoy sort of the peak Porro experience for potentially the last time, right, until he maybe loses set pieces back to Maddison in game week 22. As far as the midfield, we would be fielding Saka, Palmer, Richarlison, and Foden. I think this is obviously a midfield that's very strong, but you can see, of course, that there are also a lot of punts, right? Both Foden and Richarlison, I feel like, are short-term punts potentially, just because we could see Foden lose out minutes, not necessarily super quickly. I think, for example, Richarlison might be someone who can actually be prone to losing minutes first, because it's not like he's playing miraculously well, whereas Foden, of course, is sort of in peak shape right now. Now, of course, a lot of people will say KDB coming back, Doku coming back, Haaland coming back. That all sort of throws his minutes out of the question. But I still think that there's a lot of value to a player like Foden, particularly if a double Game Week 25 was to come to fruition. As far as, let's say, the forward line this week, I would be fielding Darwin, Julian Alvarez, and Watkins. I think these are all no-brainers, as taking the assumption, of course, that Haaland would not be able to sort of start the game versus Newcastle. So getting, for example, Alvarez to play versus a very, very weak Newcastle defense, at least that's what they have looked like in the last few weeks. And as we can see, based on underlying stats as well, ultimately, I think Alvarez, getting a start versus Newcastle is huge. Darwin still looks good, reasonably. Of course, you're looking at a very good performance from him in the EFL Cup. And so I think with that sort of context in mind, it's very likely, in my opinion, that he starts versus Bournemouth. And he's probably not going to play a crazy amount of minutes because we know that this Liverpool team is sort of deep enough to sort of have Darwin out. But I think he's played a lot of minutes in recent matches, and we've seen a lot of confidence from Klopp in him. And I'm hoping, of course, that this sort of remains. As far as Watkins, yes, of course, it's a tough fixture once again. A lot of our teams are ultimately just not perfectly looking for this week. Even, for example, let's say people who own Solanke will still be fielding him versus Liverpool at home. That's sort of just the landscape of FPL right now. This is a week where I think all of us have weak teams. So I wouldn't, for example, threat so much. Like if you're thinking about wildcarding, I would really sort of think about it only if, let's say, I couldn't address 4 to 5 players who are injured, not able to play, etc., etc. So that's my team so far. Pretty happy with it in terms of what I can actually field out with the starting 11, and considering that I'll be rolling the free transfer. Matty Cash, of course, as usual, will be sort of rotting on my bench. He might very well start versus Everton as well. I think there's just a simple reality that either, let's say, Carlos can play in a certain game or Cash can play in a certain game for this Aston Villa team. But there's no reason to, for example, punt on a Matty Cash start versus Everton away from home. Everton ultimately have been a very, very good offensive team this season, and I wouldn't have not much confidence at all in terms of Cash, particularly since I can't necessarily determine whether he starts or not. As far as, let's say, option number 2 of my FPL team, it would actually be, as I said, that sort of transfer line where I go into the 2 Brighton players. And the reason why I said I like this is because it does allow me to keep Salah all the way through AFCON no matter what. And yes, of course, I'm sort of betting and hoping that maybe Egypt get knocked out early. But I know that the true reality, of course, is that we expect Egypt to do well. And so that's something I understand. Even if I was to pursue this path, it's not like I would expect Salah to come back immediately for the Burnley game. Very likely he's going to come back in Game Week 25, and that could be the reality. And I think I'm okay with that. I'm comfortable with that if I pursue this transfer plan. The reason why I like it, though, as I said, is because it does give me the opportunity to sort of have the best captaincy option for Game Week 25, and it really does sort of open the opportunity of just sort of burning that triple captaincy chip, and then I can actually think about, flexibly what I can do with the wild card, the free hit, and even the bench boost later on this season. So that's what I kind of like about that chip strategy. Whereas, for example, if I was to pursue a free hit 25 strategy, I just don't think there's enough value going for players outside of, let's say, Liverpool and outside of City. And I don't think it would change, for example, my strategy in terms of how I move into Brighton players necessarily, right? I can always just go into these Brighton players now. Whereas, let's say, if I was to dodge Liverpool players and the City players, I'd probably be moving into Arsenal or United players. And I'm not that confident, for example, in getting a triple up of Arsenal. Neither am I really confident in going for someone like Bruno Fernandes at this point in time to sort of replace Salah or Son. So that's the sort of team that I'd be fielding option 2. Areola once again, Colwill, Estupinian, benching Pedro Porro, which is something that I'm not super keen on, but I think I would be doing in this situation. I still think potentially, we could do Pedro Porro over Colwill, but it's close. And then in terms of the midfield, I'd be playing Saka, Palmer, Richarlison, and Gross sort of in place of Foden in the previous team. Darwin, Alvarez, and Watkins once again as my front line. So this would be once again a sort of 3-4-3 setup. I think 3-4-3 is going to be super popular this week. A lot of us have 8 attackers right now, and ultimately you don't necessarily need to get rid of both Salah and Son in one week to sort of field up a team. Maybe it's different for you in your situation. But I don't own Archer, and I do have, for example, 3 attackers to sort of play around with. As far as, let's say, captaincy this week, I think it's really between still Saka and Palmer. I know some people might be thinking about Darwin as well. Personally, I'm not thinking about it. Alvarez as well, but I'm also not thinking about it. As I said, I think it's very likely that Haaland is a part of that Newcastle squad. I find it rare for him to sort of not actually cameo whatsoever. I think this is a good chance for him to sort of step in, play 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes at best. As far as, let's say, someone like Darwin, yes, he could very well be on penalties for Liverpool, and I don't want to sort of rehash the arguments about Darwin being on penalties, but there is a very high chance that Darwin could be on penalties, right? We know that he's taken a penalty in the Europa League so far. Yes, of course, they have players like Szoboszlai, but he's injured, and then McAllister, of course, he could take penalties too. But I think you've seen actually historically that Klopp likes to give his attackers penalties, right? When, for example, someone like Fabinho had an incredible penalty record, and you can Google his penalty record in Monaco, better than Salah's penalty record for a long time running. And it was never like the case that Fabinho actually took penalties, or for example, let's say even Milner was deposed to penalties. So Liverpool aren't really a club that I would say immediately like to sort of take preference of the player who actually is the best penalty taker. So far, though, in his career, Darwin's actually been exquisite as a penalty taker. He's been 12 for 12. I know it doesn't seem real that Darwin could be clinical at some element of finishing, but he is in terms of penalties, and he very well could be the penalty taker for Liverpool. I just don't think I'm going to take that chance when I have the guarantees with sort of Saka and Palmer playing 90 minutes and, you know, not being able to sort of be an early substitution just in case they play bad. That's my personal opinion in terms of where Saka and Palmer are in terms of their teams and their importance, according to their managers, or at least my interpretation of their managers. So I think it's between Saka and Palmer personally. Both have home games, which I always like to sort of back. They're both midfielders, which I also like to back over the forwards where possible, unless that forward is Haaland. And yeah, ultimately, as I said, I think I'd be leaning towards Palmer, just because this Chelsea team still, even though they've had a dismaying performance versus Middlesbrough, I still believe have posted really good attacking stats this season. Palmer is absolutely out of this world with his underlying stats, and that's even, for example, taking out of the question penalties, right? His non-penalty expected goals is still rather high. His expected assists is incredible, frankly, and still, as I said, I think he's a key player for this team. I still expect him to both play 90 minutes just like Saka. This Arsenal attack still has been really dismaying this season. It's very hard to see myself backing an Arsenal captaincy over a Chelsea captaincy here. And maybe you'll disagree with me, but personally, that's where I sit right now in terms of the captaincy side of things. But that's it. That's my sort of transfer plans and my team selection for the video. I will be, for example, leaning right now. If I actually had to say that I was leaning towards one sort of transfer variation, I think I like the flexibility of just simply going Son to Foden. And the reason why I say that is because, you know, I don't really want to be putting Pedro Porro on the bench or Colwell on the bench. I think this is a, you know, perfectly good fixture to have them. I still have, for example, one bench player in terms of cash, no matter what the situation is for myself. It doesn't seem like Darwin or Alvarez's minutes are poor, unless, of course, we get Haaland news. And so I just think, for example, the flexibility of having two free transfers in Gaming22 is going to be more beneficial for me from an FPL and sort of planning point of view. And so that's my thoughts right now in terms of my team selection. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care and goodbye.